Well, let me start thanking the organizers for inviting the ILO to participate in this important event. It was a bit difficult to reach the premises, so I apologize because I just arrived and I'm a bit wet, but very happy to be here with you. Well, first of all, just to say a few words about the ILO for, those who do not know. The ILO is the UN specialized agency on labor and social issues. No, closer. Is it better? All right, I'm sorry. It was established in 1919 in the aftermath of the World War I with the objective of promoting social justice for lasting peace. So with the understanding that lasting peace can only pursued and maintained if there is social justice. Since its establishment, it has had an important role in setting up, in establishing a framework of international labor standards in several aspects relating to work and employment. And in fact, at the first years of its establishment, already it developed and adopted a convention on forced labor. This convention was adopted in 1930, and it is the first international instrument that frames, defines, identifies, and also sets up the obligations for countries that ratify the convention on what to do in order to combat, to eliminate forced labor. The organization is, we are in a panel of public-private partnerships, which I'm very happy about, because the organization actually, it is a public-private partnership. Contrary, or how to say, its unique shape is also within the United Nations system, that it's not just made of governments, but they are equally represented businesses and labor. So when we say that the ILO has 187 members, it means that these 187 members, they are governments, employers' organizations, and trade unions. So, and it is really in this context that throughout the time, there have been a number of conventions that have been adopted and specifically on forced labor or aspects relating to the promotion of decent work. So decent work being understood as freely chosen work that gives dignity, that gives equal opportunities to individuals. So by just quoting these keywords, we understand that forced labor is certainly not decent work because of the coercion aspect, because of the fact that those engaged in forced labor and trafficking are somehow taken by coercion to undertake work involuntarily. So there are two specific conventions. One I mentioned, which is the Forced Labor Convention of 1930. Another one is the Abolition of Forced Labor of 1952. That somehow have had nearly universal ratification. So they've been ratified by more than 170 countries. And they constitute the body that in the ILO we call the fundamental conventions, meaning that the provisions apply to countries that ratify or have ratified or have not ratified this convention, because they affect really the basics of human rights. And in this context, I would like to say that, well, this is the first aspect of the work of the ILO in regards to forced labor, which is the normative aspect. So just recently, in 2014, in recognition of the fact that the phenomenon is far than be eradicated. I think I've seen also from some papers that have been presented to this workshop the recent data that the recent estimates that we produced less than and disseminated less than 1 month ago on forced labor. In 2012, we had estimated around 21 million people in forced labor that were subject to forced labor and human trafficking for labor exploitation purposes. And the estimates that we have released less than 1 month ago, in fact, they point to the fact that the number of victims is around 25 million. Now, this from one side is, we know that these are figures that are underestimated, that they are conservative estimates just because of the difficulty of detecting and collecting evidence on all cases of human trafficking and forced labor. So one part is due certainly to the improvement of the methods that we have for estimating forced labor and trafficking for labor exploitation, but certainly is also a signal that the phenomenon is not, how to say, is not reducing. And for this purpose, as you know, the United Nations, all the heads of states and countries have resolved in the adoption of the Agenda for 2030 for Sustainable Development to have a specific reference, to have a specific target to measure the progress that countries made in eliminating forced labor, human trafficking, and child labor. So this is, the ILO is in charge for monitoring this progress. And there is, together with the normative aspect, of course, a supervisory and monitoring function that it's done by the ILO through a supervisory mechanism, a body mechanism, and through reporting by countries or by organizations of employers and workers about violations in terms of forced labor and human trafficking. Once these violations are reported, there is a committee of experts which has a worldwide representation that looks into these cases up to the opening of a dossier for taking measures to get the countries take action with respect to forced labor and human trafficking. It's not an easy mechanism. The list in the ILO, it's always quite, represented in terms of countries, unfortunately. But there are cases where, through also the support of the ILO, we help to shape national policies and also national action, including through strengthening of labor market institutions, labor inspection and other mechanisms that they should be, as it is a responsibility of countries, they should be in place to prevent and to counter this phenomena. A case that has been recently somehow has seen improvement has been forced labor and human trafficking in Myanmar. Out of this, the country for many years has been in the list, which has hampered also the pursuance of development cooperation and somehow the ban with a view to eliminating forced labor and human trafficking. There are countries that are now under, how to say, scrutiny, but also under supervision, that they are, for instance, the countries that adopt the kafala system, which exposes particularly migrant workers and the most vulnerable migrant workers to forced labor and human trafficking. There is another aspect of the work of the ILO that revolves around advocacy and partnerships, and this is again an example of public-private partnerships. I will maybe elaborate a bit later during the discussion about these aspects and also the instruments that we have to promote fair recruitment and also to bring together different partners in this alliance that has been established just 2 years ago, the Alliance 8.7, to eliminate forced labor and human trafficking. Thank you.